Whenever we're talking about something like as pervasive as like anxiety, there's always stats that you don't know if these stats are true or not. You have no idea if the stats are true about anxiety. So if you listen to the stats, there's a vast majority of people, I think somewhere in the, I don't know why I did that, somewhere in the 70s, like 70% or like in the early 80% of people who have anxiety, struggle with it. And it's a pervasive thing. It's such an accepted reality that I just want to have a conversation about it. Let's talk a little bit about anxiety. I know a lot of people, let me say this too, man. I know a lot of people that struggle with anxiety. And for some of them, anxiety has been a crippling thing for them. Sometimes it's embarrassing for them. And oftentimes it's just a crippling reality. And as a pastor for the last 16 years, 20 plus in ministry, I've tried to help a lot of people with anxiety. And sometimes it's encouraging and sometimes it's discouraging because anxiety is such a big deal in people's lives that when you struggle with it, anxiety can feel like almost like a dragon is sitting on your chest. Like there's no way you're going to get rid of this or deal with it. So let me say a couple of things about anxiety so that we can understand what we're talking about. Let me say one thing that may surprise you about anxiety, if you're a believer, of course. First things first, welcome to CNN. I'm Kirk Kennedy, the underdog. Let's go in. On this channel, we take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. We are on the road to 5K. We are at, I think, 3597. We were at 3603, and 6 people left because they don't like what I was saying. So that's fine. Let's get back over 3600. I would appreciate that. Let's keep it moving. Let's get it. All right, let's talk about anxiety. Let's have a real conversation about anxiety. The good and the bad, if you will. All right, first and foremost, let me tell you something that may surprise you that could be a good thing if you really struggle with anxiety. The first thing is anxiety, biblically speaking, isn't always a sin. Now, many people would classify anxiety as just bottom line, not trusting the Lord, and then not trusting the Lord would be a sin. All right. But you can see on a couple of occasions, a few of which we'll look at, the point of this video is not to say that anxiety is to prove it's not a sin. I've done that before on videos for a while. Maybe that's a video for another time. But anxiety isn't always a sin. So I'm going to ignore the whole book of the Psalms, and we'll talk about that later. And let me just point out 2 verses that shape my position on this. And I think there's more, but let me just give you 2. Anxiety is not always a sin. Here's the first passage that helps me see that. 1 Peter 5, 6 and 7. It says this: humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. And then verse 7. Casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. All right. First reason why anxiety is not always a sin. Because this verse, here's what God says in this verse. Peter's writing, right? Peter's writing to Christians who are exasperated and afraid. They are running for their lives in the dispersion. Christians are scattered. They're afraid of being persecuted. And so Peter tells them to humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God so that at the proper time he may exalt you. And then he says this: casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you, right? So there is, if you think about anxiety as a sin, right? Here's a question that I think you have to at least consider if you think anxiety is always and only a sin. What other sin issues does the Bible tell us to cast on the Lord because he cares for us? Like, he doesn't say cast your sexual immorality, cast your lying, cast your fits of rage, cast your gossip, cast your slander, cast your division, cast your sinful judgment. There's no other sin issues that we're told to cast on the Lord because he cares for us. we're told to cast them off, to put away these things, right? Put to death these things that are earthly within you. But you don't really see anxiety in the list of those sins to put away. What you see is verses like this, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. So you don't see that in other sin issue. So here God is saying, I want you to bring your anxieties to me. It's almost like he's saying, I understand and I care about you. I know what you're worried about. Put them on me. Let me help you with those. All right. Here's the second verse to look at, to consider. 2 Corinthians 11:12. Here's Paul. Paul in this chapter is going through a whole bunch of things that prove he's an apostle and all the suffering that he's experienced in being an apostle. And then in verse 28, here's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11:28. He says this, and apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches, right? I don't think Paul was confessing sin here. He wasn't saying, hey, I'm sinning against the Lord. He was acknowledging that I am very worried. I'm anxious about how the churches are doing that I'm responsible for. This isn't a sin issue that Paul's talking about. So anxiety isn't, there's other verses I could give you. Like we could go look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And when it talked about, when he said, my soul is sorrowful to death, like the Greek word that's used to describe what Jesus is saying can be translated anxious, anxiety, like a deep anxiety, right? But we'll save that for another time. The reality is anxiety isn't always sin, but it's always challenging. I don't know many people who struggle with anxiety who were like, oh, no, I love it. It's good. It's fine. I don't mind it at all. So let's talk about what is anxiety then. How should we process? It's not always sinful. It can be. I think it can be sinful. We'll talk about how it can be sinful. What is anxiety? If you go to a number of different places, they're going to give you a number of different explanations for anxiety. Let me give you one that I think is simplistic, that you can see play out in your own life. If you struggle with anxiety and you're watching this video is hopefully meant to help you. There's going to be some things I'm going to challenge a little bit, but this isn't a judgment against you or anyone, because we're all flawed and we all need to be dependent on the Lord. And anxiety is just one of those things. It's so pervasive and it's so normalized in our culture that it's almost like, it's almost like an expectation that just, hey, you're just anxious. It just is what it is. And I don't think that's biblically true. But what is anxiety? Anxiety is an emotional, /psychological response to a promise that a negative event or events you don't want to happen will happen. All right. This is what anxiety is. If you think about anxiety, this is what anxiety is. It's an emotional, or we'll say for now, psychological response to a promise that a negative event or events that you do not want to happen is going to happen. All right. Anxiety is not just a feeling, right? It's not just an uneasy feeling about something. Anxiety is actually a promise. It is promising the person who is anxious that some negative event that they don't want to happen is going to happen, and now they're responding to this in an emotional uneasiness, a sort of fear, a worry. Anxiety is sort of a mix of being afraid, being worried, it has a number of different things to add to it. It's a promise, and by that, what I mean by promise is it tells you that it's almost prophetic. It tells you that something that you do not want to happen is going to happen, and you can't do anything about it. And so the response of the person is this uneasy fear or whatever, and it can have a physiological effect, which is why I said psychological, because it can affect the brain and have a physiological impact on people. People have, anxiety attacks and things like that. They call them panic attacks, right? Those things are real. I've seen people have those and have had to walk people in the midst of those through having real panic attacks from anxiety. So this is a real thing. It's a promise. If there's something that you don't want to happen, that you believe is going to happen, and then you react to this thing. All right. Now, here's the hardest truth about anxiety. Here's the hardest truth. And this may challenge some of you if you struggle with it. And I'm not meaning to offend or challenge. I'm just trying to be fair and honest about the reality of it. The hardest truth about anxiety is that for most people, anxiety is a decision. It's not a disease or a disorder. It's a decision. This is why Jesus says, the Bible says, cast your anxieties on the Lord because he cares for you, right? Most diseases, Jesus healed. You're never told to cast your disease or disorder. For most people, it is a decision. It's a choice to respond anxiously more than it's a disease or a disorder. A disease or a disorder, like COVID, is not something you can cast off. You caught COVID. That's a disease, right? There are disorders like schizophrenia, right? Where you can't just cast that off on the Lord. That's something that's a little bit different. Anxiety often feels that way because it's kind of like all encompassing for some people. But for most people, it's a decision, not a disease or a disorder. Now, the reason why I say most, because I do think that for some people, anxiety has been so embedded into that person's thinking and acting that it has an effect like a disorder. Like, to get off of anxiety will require the kinds of potential medication or deliverance procedures that are deeper than just, hey, I need to not decide not to react this way. But I think the vast majority of people are given the title disorder or disease, and largely anxiety is a decision, a choice to react this way because of unbelieving this promise. So what are the stages? Let's talk about the stages of anxiety. Stages of anxiety. First, you feel it. You feel this uneasiness, this fear. Once you hear the promise and you feel it. You start to feel different. You start to get worried. You start to feel afraid. You start imagining scenarios of where you don't want it to happen. You start, all of a sudden, this becomes a part of your thinking, and it catches on quickly. You feel it first. But the reason you feel it, but a lot of it is you believe what it promises. I keep in mind, anxiety is a promise. It's almost like a negative prophecy. It's a negative prophetic, it's a negative promise, a negative prophecy that something that you don't want to happen is going to happen. So maybe it's, I know if you're a young mom or something and you're going to a mall, oh my God, someone's going to kidnap my kid. And all of a sudden you start being afraid of everything. And this is what happens. You start to believe that, you think that, because yes, that does happen in the world, but the promise is it's going to happen to your child. And you believe that promise. These are the stages. You actually, it's really, you believe the promise is really first, then you feel it, and then you react to that promise. You react to it. So now it's like, okay, I'm going to be very anxious. I'm going to tell my kid, you better not do this. You do not walk away. Do not, you get offended. Like, you ever been really anxious because you can't find someone, and then when you find them, you're happy to see them, but you're also extremely angry? Right? You ever been like really angry at the person? Like, you're happy, but you're also angry. Why? Because in your mind, they made you feel anxious. You believe that and this is the reality. You believe the promise, you feel this anxiety, and then you react to it by your actions. And this is why anxiety is a challenging thing, because we're so confident that what we think is going to negatively happen, that we don't want to happen, is going to happen, that we start to react in ways that, in characteristic traits that are very difficult, very challenging. I've seen this happen to many people for years. I've sat in rooms with people that were convinced of, I'll give you an example. One time, there was a woman I knew whose son, he was young, he was a young kid, he was on YouTube. He's maybe, I don't know, maybe around 7 years old. And he was watching YouTube, and a trailer for a movie came on. And I think it was, at the time, I think it was a Fast and the Furious. Maybe it was the Hobbs and Shaw, the Rock and Jason Statham. I think it was their movie. And the little boy saw a trailer for the movie. And in the beginning of the trailer, there was, I guess they were walking in this strip club scene, and he told his mom that he saw that and doesn't want to see the movie. When she contacted me, she was crying. Oh no, he's ruined. He saw, and she was crying. She was always worried. So everything for her was about, this anxiety of now what's going to happen to him. He's ruined. He's this. And that boy is years older, has never once watched Corn, has never once, as far as we know, given in to lust in any kind of way, any kind of way. But she was anxious for years and knew that he was ruined by watching a couple of seconds of a trailer of a video. It promised that now he's going to be doing all these things. And because of that, she was shutting down. What are you watching? What are you looking at? He wasn't doing anything. And it caused a disruption in their relationship that I've had to help them work through because of her anxiety of him seeing that trailer. This is what anxiety does. It promises a negative future event, and then you react to that promise with negative attitudes and actions. And so anxiety is really challenging. It's hard. But here's the underlying reality of anxiety. The underlying, and this is, I'm giving you, 20 years of pastoral ministry and helping people walk through this a lot and really see like, wow, this is, having studied this and read about this a lot, it's really interesting. The underlying reality of anxiety is that the promise of it may or may not be true. In fact, I read a stat that said 83% of what people are anxious about never actually happens. It said, hey, I wish I could pull it up. I should have pulled it up, but I'm just running and gunning. I'm out in San Francisco now. We're getting ready to leave tomorrow to go somewhere else. So I'm running and gunning. But it said 83% of what most people are anxious about never actually happens. Somewhere the stat was somewhere around there. Couldn't believe it. I just thought, wow, that's crazy. But if you share that stat with people, that doesn't soothe them. It doesn't make them. There's something about, anxiety. This is going to sound weird what I'm about to say, but I think this is true. You ever know what like dark humor is? There's like a genre of movies called dark humor, right? Where the stuff is funny, but it's kind of like dark a little bit. Like, it's funny, but kind of wild a little bit. Anxiety sort of is the dark humor of control a little bit. Like there's a sense where part of what people think they struggle with anxiety, but it also makes them feel there's a certain comfort that comes with anxiety in a real dark humor kind of way because you feel like you know what's going to happen. You kind of have this sense of like this confidence that this is going to happen. And there's something about knowing the future, knowing what's going to happen. There's something we get from that. Anxiety promises that you know a little bit about the future. And even though it's negative, people are reacting to that. But it's almost always never true. The boy, his life isn't ruined. He's a good kid for all intents and purposes. And it just was like, okay, life goes on. But anxiety doesn't tell you that. Anxiety tells you the negative, the worst thing. But here's the other thing anxiety does. This is the strength of anxiety is this. Anxiety exaggerates reality. It exaggerates reality. I know some young moms with kids, and you have a couple kids, and anxiety just exaggerates everything they're doing. It exaggerates. It's like, you kids never listen. You always, and it's like, no, they don't always, or they don't never do anything except breathe and sin. But their sin doesn't always look like you. Anxiety, it exaggerates reality. It makes this thing like when you're anxious, here's where people would say, oh, it's a sin against the Lord. Anxiety exaggerates the reality that whatever the prophetic negative or the negative promise that you think is going to happen, it's so big that not even God can do anything about it. So you're just responding with this fear, this negative emotion. It exaggerates reality. It makes it seem like whatever you don't want to happen is going to be the worst thing ever, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that's one of its greatest strengths is it exaggerates reality. It makes it seem like everything is going to happen this bad, nothing is good, and no one cares. I've heard people talk with that kind of rhetoric, that kind of language, and it's just not true. It's just not reality. It exaggerates it. I've had to calm people down, like, listen, no one's thinking that way. Like, why do you think others think that way about you because of this situation? Like, who said that to you? I've had people like, everyone hates me now, everyone thinks I'm gonna, and it's like, well, who's told you that? Like, where are you getting this from? Like, what attitudes and actions have you seen a person say or do that gives you that impression? And oftentimes they don't have it. It's just how they feel. Anxiety exaggerates reality, and it exaggerates how you should feel about the reality. It's just like, hey, listen, whoa, I don't know if everyone thinks that. I've had to tell multiple people, listen, I don't know if people think that way about you. I've never heard anyone say that. And if they do, then you're probably not going to know it because they're not going to tell you. But this is just the reality of anxiety. The other challenge is too, most people, you relate to people based on that anxiety. And this is what I call the weaponization of anxiety. This is where it becomes really, 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 really dangerous, is when you weaponize it because you start relating to people through that anxiety. You start getting offended at people who make you anxious, whether it's your children, whether it's circumstances. You get offended at people. Like I've seen people get angry at other people, right? Because you want people to deliver you from anxiety instead of God. You want people to make you not feel anxious. And so you get offended at them because they're not stopping your anxiety, right? They're not stopping. And it's like, listen, people can't stop your anxiety because anxiety, in many ways, is a decision to react a certain way, to first believe a negative promise and then react that way. People can't stop that. People can't stop you from believing that, and they can't stop it unless it's something that they are supposed to say and do. Maybe they cannot do that, but for the most part, no, it doesn't happen that way. People want to be delivered from anxiety from other people instead of God because God doesn't move fast enough. Anxiety says God is slow. He's not going to. So you have to get other people to help you with this. And so you start relating to people based on that anxiety. So the anxious person, they tend to get angry at whomever they think is causing the anxiety, but they rarely look at self, right? Like they'll get angry at their kids or their spouses or their coworkers or the person next to them. It's like the people who are causing your anxiety is really often, in most cases, you, because anxiety is a decision. It's a decision. You know, it's funny. Even if someone puts a gun to your head, like people say, yeah, well, if someone puts a gun to your head, your reaction to that is still a decision. The gun is not forcing you to do whatever they said. The fear of dying is. The fear of dying. So either you choose to do what they say or you choose to die if they're holding a gun. Just using an extreme example. It's still a choice in that moment, even if it feels like an unfair choice, it's still a choice. And people tend to get angry. I've talked to counseled many parents angry at their children because they're making them anxious. And it's like, no, you're choosing to be anxious or respond anxiously towards them because of the way that they're acting. You cannot control what they're, you're afraid they're going to knock their juice off the counter. You're afraid they're going to drop the, whatever the, radio into the bathtub or something. You're afraid of, so these things are what's causing the anxiety. And you start to weaponize it by making people have to stop doing things that make you anxious. And that becomes a real challenge. People who struggle with anxiety, I don't know if they realize what it's like to live with someone who really struggles with it. It can be very challenging because you feel like, man, there's always something wrong or you're always afraid of something. And it's just challenging. The other thing that anxious people do is they get angry when others don't join them in their being anxious, right? You're just like, well, you just don't care like I do. It's like, no, I care about my children too. I just refuse to get worried about something I can't control. But I'll try to do things to prevent certain things, but I can't worry. I can't be afraid of that because anxiety is always like, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. And you just never know. And then you believe it to be true. I know people who just don't almost won't do anything because they are crippled by what if? What if this happens? It's like, okay, well, what if it doesn't though? Yeah, but what if it does? You can't live that way. But a lot of times, people who are anxious will be offended at people who do not, especially loved ones, spouses, other close friends, pastors, counselors. You'll be offended at people not joining you in that anxiety because one of the lies of anxieties is just that, hey, you're thinking about this and you care about what happens. And if another person isn't as anxious as you, then they just don't care as much as you do. And that's not true. Oftentimes, people are saying, hey, I'm not going to allow myself to be afraid or to be angry or whatever because I'm worried about what could happen. Anxiety, remember, it is a promise, it's a negative promise, a negative prophecy about something that's going to happen that you don't want to happen. And when you relate to people, when you're offended at them because they need to stop making you feel anxious, then you weaponize it. And then it becomes really challenging to be around. I know some people who grew up with like an anxious mom or anxious, usually it's an anxious mom. Most people don't say they grew up with an anxious dad, from my limited vantage point. And as adults, these people find it very difficult to be around their mom. They find it very difficult because, and I know some people don't even want to bring their children, their mom's grandchildren around them because they don't want their kids exposed to that anxiety. Because you start weaponizing it and you want people to submit to your anxious things. You want people to submit to like, okay, well, you need to do this and do this and do this, and you need to take this with you and do this. Like, man, I'm not doing all that. I'm just going to the movies. Like, I'm not going to take no pepper spray and do all that just to go. Don't get me wrong. Those things I'm using sort of sparse examples because I don't want to be too specific because then people will be like, man, Pastor Kurt was putting my information out there. But I think it's just like you start to demand that people respond to your anxiety as if it's normal, as if it's a good, healthy thing. And the reality is, no, if you don't get a hold of this anxiety, you're going to cripple others as well as be crippled in your life because you're always going to be uneasy. And also the other side of anxiety is that there's another A word that it comes from. There is sort of a dark humor kind of arrogance, right? There's an arrogance that you know what's going to happen, that you thinking about this, that you care, and that no one else sees what you see. And it's like, well, maybe no one else is as afraid of the possibility as you. There's almost an arrogance like other people don't have the discernment that you have, when in reality, some of those people are just making a decision to not respond anxiously the way that you are. And I mean, I believe me, man, it's really, I really feel for people who struggle with anxiety a lot because it can feel crippling, but you also cripple others because rarely do people who are, they may say, well, I'm a very anxious person, but they say that almost like as a concession. Like I have COVID, I can't do anything about it. I'm an anxious person. That's one of the biggest challenges with that is that people want others to deliver them from anxiety. People just don't. But the main thing is most people want others to excuse their anxiety rather than hold them accountable for it. So we're like, well, I'm just a very anxious person. And they'll acknowledge it. It's like a bad thing, but it's not like a thing that I'm trying to not be this way. I want to make, how do you fight against this actively, right? What thoughts do you think? What do you go to verses when the math just ain't mathing, right? That doesn't come out often. It's just a react. It's, hey, I'm an anxious person. I struggle with anxiety, but I don't think again, the people that I've come across when I've passed it over the years, I think there can be this sentiment that like they want you to understand that they have it, but it's almost like I should feel sorry for you because you have anxiety. And again, there are some people who it can be very, very severe, and that type of compassion is necessary and that process of it. But there are many people who are, it's a decision. You've sown to a way of thinking and acting where you believe the negative things that are true. Your reaction is trying to control the outcome that you told you can't, and then your emotions are all over the place. And then you don't want people to challenge you on it. You want people to be understanding. And you can't do that. If you struggle with anxiety, please know that while it's challenging, the people that know you and love you struggle with your anxiety too, because you're often weaponizing it and making other people have to want them to feel the way you feel or do things to somehow stop you from feeling anxious. But in reality, the Bible says, cast your anxieties on the Lord because he cares for you. So how do you do that? This is a pastoral video if you haven't figured it out by now. How do you cast your anxieties on the Lord? Let me give you just three quick steps. Three quick steps. And this isn't, first of all, I think you have to believe it's a decision and not a disorder. I think for most people, this is true. If you think it's a disorder, something that because a disorder or disease is not something that like it's something you caught, something that happened to you. You're passive in that sense. A disorder can be something that just is a chemical imbalance in your brain that you had no control over. A disease is something that you inherited or you caught at some point in your life. But if it's a decision, if anxiety is a decision, then when I'm anxious, I can say, what is my responsibility here? Like I'm acting anxious, or I'm choosing to be anxious. If it's a disorder, or then it's about medication. If it's a disease, and it's about compassion and medication. I'm not saying medication is wrong. I just don't know any medication that I've known of. There's a lot I could be saying. I'm not saying it right now. I know that there's no disease that there's no medication that you can take that eliminates anxiety. It just doesn't happen, because that would be the greatest selling pharmaceutical pill in the world would be that pill if it could happen. No, some of them may make you feel a little bit happier so that you don't feel as anxious, but they don't do the real work of going after it. They don't help you cast your anxieties on the Lord. They don't. They just help you feel great for a time being until your body gets used to it. Because you can't listen. You could like alcoholism. People call it a disease, and there's some people were born alcoholics based on their mother and stuff like that. That can be true, but a lot of times, even something like alcoholism, which is largely considered a disease today, began by decisions. Right? There were a number of decisions that a person made to drink and kept drinking and drinking, and they enjoyed it. And you do it so much that your body now becomes chemically dependent on that alcohol. Like your body is shaped by it. That I remember one time, this guy, the doctors told this guy, listen, your body and your liver and stuff is so damaged by alcohol that you would die quicker if you just stopped it than it would be to try to. It was incredible to hear that. I was like, wow, this is crazy. But a lot of it is like, it's a decision for most people. It's not a disorder. But the second thing I think to cast your anxieties on the Lord is don't focus on stopping the feeling of anxiety. Don't think like, okay, what can I do to stop feeling anxious? Just think, okay, how can I glorify God as an anxious person right now? Don't think about it from the standpoint of stopping feeling anxious, because you're not guaranteed that. We're not guaranteed to have that happen. We're not guaranteed to not feel anxious. Even if we cast our cares on the Lord, we're just not guaranteed that we're going to no longer be anxious the minute we do that. But we have to say, okay, Lord, I want to stop feeling anxious, sure, but how do I glorify you right now in this anxiety? Like what does it look like? What do I think? What do I say? What do I do? Start focusing on that, because if you're focusing on not feeling anxious and you still feel anxious hours, days, weeks later, you're going to feel like the Lord's not doing anything. No, the Lord is a coach, right? If you ever played sports of any kind, you might not believe this, but I played basketball. I was actually really competitive. And my coach, we used to do these drills, these suicide. We had these dribbling drills. They were like suicides. You dribble up the line, sprint back. Then you go a little further, the next line, sprint back. Then you go to the 3/4 line, sprint back. Then you go to the baseline and back. And we had to do 5 of those before You do one at a time, pass it to your partner. We did 5 of those. We used to hate those drills. I hated those drills. That drill was the worst drill. I hated that drill. But when we would be playing in a game and it was the fourth quarter and our conditioning kicked in because we're so used to running that our conditioning was stronger than that team, we were able to make those foul shots at the end of the game and score. And we realized the value of that conditioning, that those drills, those suicides with the ball. We saw all that running. We used to do this other drill where you had to sprint the sideline and you jog the baseline. So you'd be sprinting, you get to this debate, and you'd be running, jogging real slow because you want to get that breath in. You would sprint the baseline, jog the baseline, and sprint the sideline. The sideline is longer, right? But that was for conditioning. They knew that, like, hey, you need to have conditioning so that when you're tired in the game, you know how to press through. The Lord is kind of like that coach that says, hey, listen, I may not take the feeling of anxiety away from you right now because I want to train you how to trust me, how to honor me, even though you're feeling anxious. He wants to train us how to cast our anxieties. And so he doesn't always take away the feeling of anxiety when we do that. So we have to understand, okay, Lord, it's not about how do I stop feeling anxious. It's how do I glorify you? How do I act while I'm anxious? What does that mean? Third and final was like, look at the Psalms. Look to the Psalms. Like, if you look at the Psalms in the 80s, like, most Psalms, honestly, are not most. There's a good bit of Psalms that are largely, I'm anxious, I'm struggling, my circumstances are crazy. Where are you? And then at some point, but you, oh God, you fill in the blank, right? The Psalms are the best antidote to anxiety for 2 reasons. One, because it shows that like read Psalm 88. Read Psalm 88 when you get a chance. That joint is crazy. The Psalms show us that, one, God cares about the full range of emotions that we experience. I mean, can you imagine being David? We hear these stories in the Old Testament. We just think, oh, whatever. Man, David was told by Samuel that he's going to be the next king of Israel, but Saul was still king. David had to wait some. Man, it said David was playing the harp for Saul. Bring, bring. And then it said Saul threw a spear at the dude. Can you imagine? Like, I can't imagine freestyling like, yo, I got Christ on my side and everything is rise. We all, and it's like, what was it? It's like, what are you doing, man? Like, this dude was having spears thrown at him, and he was told he was going to be like, this dude was on the run for years from the current king, knowing that he was going to be the next king. So a lot of the Psalms that he wrote were like, man, Lord, my enemies are all over me, especially in like book 1 and book 2. My enemies are encamped all around me. It was Saul and them were his enemies. He wasn't even king yet. He wasn't worried about the Philistines, He was worried about Saul and Saul's men. Like, God didn't take away those things because he wanted David to write literature that captured the emotion of being afraid and being anxious so that we could look at that and be like, hey, this is a normal part of the process. And trusting God still has to happen, even though my enemies are encamped around me. So look at the Psalms. Look to the Psalms are really good. And you can even Google like, hey, the Psalms, anxiety Psalms. Look at those Psalms and look at the ones that speak to the issue of anxiety. It'll be huge. And lastly, remember this about the Psalms. Complaining about God is a sin, but complaining to God, that's a psalm. Complaining about God, man, I don't trust him. He doesn't do that. That's a sin. But when you complain to God, Lord, where are you? I'm hurting. That's a psalm. God respects that. He appreciates that. He can handle that. He gave us a whole book of, there was a lot of good psalms, man. Blessed is the Lord. There's that, but there's also like, man, where are you, Lord? My enemies are all around me. Death and are my only companions. Death and Sheol, man, those are my only companions. Like, where are you at? There is this sense of David and others were very anxious. And God let that be in the Bible so that we could look at that and be like, hey, this is real. Like, it's on one level, not that it's okay to be this way, but this is, God understands the anxiety. This is why, going back to 1 Peter, and I think this is where you cast your anxieties on the Lord. I think you look to the Psalms and then you kind of repeat the things that they're saying to the Lord often because he cares for you. Like, this is the one thing I'll give David this credit. David was on the run a lot, but he still knew that God cared. He didn't, even though at times he got angry with God, like, man, what are you doing? Why aren't you? My enemies are around me. Like they're mocking me and you're doing nothing. He still cared though. He knew that God cared about him. And that's what God did. That's why he could do like a Psalm 73. When I look at all the people, they got everything figured out. They're enjoying life. But then I look at the other thing. Oh, but you, oh God, I look at the eternity. It's you have to believe that God cares for you. But if caring for you means I'm going to take away the anxiety, the way you feel, then you may struggle, because God is a coach and he wants to make sure that you have the kind of stamina, the obedient stamina that you'll need when you're in a situation. And if he takes away every time you pray and he takes it away, then there's some ways that you won't grow. Complaining about God is a sin. Complaining to God is a psalm. Appreciate y'all. See y'all in the next video. Peace.